and I'm focusing a lot on health and wellness and how we can feel better. So if that seems interesting to you, please continue on with this video. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about something that I think it's a little bit confusing for people, and that's food sensitivities. So I really want to start off by kind of separating what a food sensitivity or a food intolerance is versus an actual food allergy. Because while they get confused, oftentimes the responses in your body are actually very, very different. So food sensitivities or food intolerances are typically types of food that your body has trouble digesting, and this is through your gut. So this has nothing to do with an actual allergic reaction, but just how your gut actually tolerates these different foods. And really common food intolerances are a gluten intolerance or eggs or dairy or even like caffeine. Some people just really can't tolerate. And oftentimes, because this is a gut response, you get those similar symptoms that are bloating, gas, fatigue, brain fog, headaches, just things that because your body isn't getting the nutrients they need, or instead they're getting nutrients that they really don't react well to, that's why we get those symptoms that ultimately don't make us feel that good. A food allergy, however, is very different because it is an immune response, which means it is a histamine response. So your body's histamine count goes way up if you have an actual food allergy. The most common example I think of is like a nut allergy. And some of the other symptoms with food allergies are much more along the lines of dizziness, fainting, severe headaches, again with the trouble breathing, the hives, the rash, just kind of all of that. That's definitely not pleasant. But is also a little bit of a higher grade than a food sensitivity. So the next thing I want to address is what actually causes food sensitivity. And again, there's not really a clear-cut answer to this, but there are some things that have higher food sensitivity rates. So the first thing I would look at is absence of an enzyme. There's an enzyme that is missing in your body that makes it unable to digest certain foods. I think a really big example of this is if you're lactose intolerant, dairy intolerant, any of that. It's because you're generally missing the lactase enzyme, which allows that to break down in the body. And if you don't have that, you're likely going to have a reaction that I mentioned earlier: bloating, gas, fatigue, brain fog. Any of that kind of comes back to the fact that your natural makeup of your gut doesn't contain like that lactase. And a lot of people don't realize that it can come down to that. I have found that there are some pretty good dietary supplements for enzymes out there. And it kind of depends on the person. Again, I've had some really good experiences with some and not with others. But basically what that's going to do is that's going to put more stomach acid back into your system so that you still have the ability to digest these foods at a higher rate. It doesn't mean that like one day you're lactose intolerant and one day you're not. Your body still naturally cannot digest that the same way, but I do think these enzymes can help, and I will definitely link a few good ones down below. Okay, so the second one is actually a pretty big one in my opinion, but it's the fact that there are chemicals in foods, additives and chemicals that we're eating because our food is highly processed, and even a few years ago it didn't used to be processed the same way. So for example, if you're going to get Cheerios and you're going to get Lay's potato chips or something of that sort that already isn't the healthiest, on top of the fact that with like the Lay's potato chips, you are getting a lot of starches and a lot of oils, you're also getting chemicals to keep the food fresh. And that wasn't used at such a high level that it is now. So therefore, the more your body eats of that, if you have a diet that consists of Lay's potato chips and then Cheerios for breakfast and then maybe some sort of like prepackaged or frozen meal for dinner, the amount of chemicals you are ingesting on a daily basis is way higher than it ever used to be. So therefore, our food intolerances spike because our body isn't used to processing that, and it's not really made to process that. You know, like another example I have that I think people don't always realize is like, let's look at the meat we're buying. If you are not a vegetarian, if you are a meat eater, then please pay attention to this, because there's so many times that you kind of have the option between grass-fed, grain-fed, somewhere in between, organic, non-organic. There's so many options that we don't always know what to buy. However, when we look back at what is a grain-fed animal, Let's look at the condition in which the pig is being raised. If the pig essentially is not healthy and being filled with antibiotics and grains and preservatives and additives and whatever else that they're trying to do to fatten the pig up, then we're eating all of that too. So most of the antibiotics that said pig would be ingesting, we would then be eating, because it is really just a chain of events. So we start from the way it was raised, and then what it was fed, and then when it is killed, we eat the remains of that. So I think it's really good to remember that because there's this higher rate of chemical additives in even the foods that we think are healthy, it's good to just really look at the labels. And that's why I recommend the first thing to do is always buy organic, always shop organic, always look for those grass-fed options, because I do think that is the start to kind of healing your gut, especially if you already have a food sensitivity established. The third thing I think is really important also kind of ties with what I was just talking about, and that is discovering additives in your foods. And I think as a whole, the food industry is becoming more aware of this, but they're definitely not gone. And I think a lot of these common additives are nitrates, nitrites, sulfites. A big one for me is MSG. And while again, we are producing more organic and whole ingredient sort of ingredient lists, which I think is amazing, those aren't gone, especially because the food industry is still not regulated the way that it needs to be. A lot of those additives can actually still be hidden ingredients. If you've ever looked at the back of an ingredient box and it says less than 2% of the following, those additives, especially like again the nitrates, nitrites, MSG, to kind of be under the radar, because the USDA technically can't say anything because it is less than 2%. That's why I always read labels and always recommend reading labels, because you really never know until you start seeing these ingredients and seeing even their aliases. And I think it's good to just keep being conscious about that. Okay. So whether it's from this video or just from your own experience and you've discovered that, hey, I think I have a food insensitivity, where do I go from here? The first tip I can give you is please talk to your doctor. Personally, for me, I would definitely recommend a naturopath doctor or a functional medicine doctor, because they're much more likely to run tests that aren't just blood work or testing they call like your panels or your typical levels that you'll get when you draw blood for a Western medicine practice. Not to say that they're bad. I think Western medicine does have a really important place in our system. But I think if you're looking for food insensitivity, you're going to have better luck with a naturopath or a functional medicine doctor, because they can test to the source and they're testing for sensitivity, not allergy. Most of the time, if you're going to be going to a Western medicine doctor, they're going to test you for an allergy. And 9 times out of 10, that will come up negative. They won't really be able to help you with healing your gut and aiding in better digestion and giving you supplements that you need. A lot of times the Western medicine doctor, they will prescribe antibiotics, which is actually very harmful to the gut and can continue to break down that stomach acid that you already don't have enough of 9 times out of 10. But even on top of that, antibiotics can really just strip all of your body of the good bacteria, also the bad bacteria. But if you're dealing with a food sensitivity, there usually is not a bad bacteria to be getting rid of in the first place. I think the next thing that I highly, highly recommend doing is just starting a food log or a food journal. And I don't say this in an attempt to start a diet, but I think once you start tracking what you're eating and tracking how you're feeling in regards to those foods, you kind of get a much clearer sense of what's going on in your body. For example, I use food logs, love them. It has helped me so much in dealing with some of my health problems. And for me, if I go every day and I eat a cookie at 5 p.m. every day, and at 6 p.m. I continue to feel lethargic and really tired and my anxiety goes up, and I can always track it back to that one thing I'm eating, to me that's so much knowledge gained that I don't need a doctor to tell me necessarily, that I can do on my own. So the last tip that I give you, I kind of mentioned earlier, but it is to get tested, especially if you're skeptical and just not really sure where to start. Getting tested is great. Whether you end up doing that through a functional medicine doctor or a naturopath, or doing that on your own, you have options in both avenues. And I think that's really important to know. Especially now, we have some great companies out, and I'll link them down below. My favorites have been Verisana and Healthline and Everlywell, and Everlywell is rated very, very highly. So I haven't personally used their products, but I love their selection and will definitely be using them in the future. And what this does is it's a take-home saliva test for food testing or food insensitivities usually. You can also do a version where you prick your finger and you do that, I think 5 times, and then you just send it to the lab. It's pretty pain-free, and I, again, would highly, highly recommend this. Okay, so you got your test back and you realize that you are, in fact, sensitive to a certain group of foods. Doesn't matter what it is, you still have some adjustments to make in your life. And a lot of times I get the reactions from people saying like, my God, my life is over. How do you do it? I don't understand how to eat. What does that mean for me? And it can be really overwhelming, especially to take in that feedback from other people who are also wondering what you're gonna do. So for me, I think the first thing is to just be patient, because it's such a journey, and throughout all this you're going to figure out what foods you really like, what foods you can tolerate, and what foods you just can't stand. And I think that's totally fine. And again, it's not something that happens in a day, and I think trying to force ourselves to feel better can actually have the inverse effect. Another tip I would give you is to really start researching your grocery stores and your restaurants, especially ones that are in close proximity to you or ones that you just generally enjoy. For me, I remember I went gluten-free a few years back, and the first thing I did with the help of my mom was to just start researching these grocery stores and what kind of foods can I eat now. Trader Joe's does this really well, at least in terms of gluten intolerance. They have a whole list dedicated to gluten-free foods, so you can actually go through the store with that list, and you don't have to keep asking people, hey, is this gluten-free? Hey, do you know what's in this? Hey, or like just reading the back of the ingredient list. I think another thing that I talk about a lot, and I know I talk with my family about this a lot, is you start to feel this stress for eating out. Call ahead. Read their menu ahead, talk to your friends, and just let them know what's going on, because more than likely you'll have staff at the restaurant who will be able to tell you exactly what you can and can't eat. If you find yourself in a situation where you're at a restaurant, maybe didn't do your research, and you can't eat anything, I always recommend carrying a snack, not a full-blown meal in your bag or anything, but for me, I always put a protein bar or some cashews, like some sort of nut, or just like some sort of protein or fat that can kind of get me through. So that worst case scenario, at least I'm not super, super hungry and miserable. The worst experiences with restaurants have been when I've stayed silent and just hoped for the best. And it was never the best. And I always felt really bad after. It wasn't until I started actually advocating for myself and saying, hey, I'm gluten-free. Can you please give me some selections that have zero cross-contamination and are gluten-free? And I've gotten great responses from that. And people have always been really understanding, in my opinion. So at the end of the day, like, there is no shame in saying, hey, I want to go somewhere else. Or even saying, hey, I'm going to stay in and I'm going to cook my own meal and I'll meet you out like afterwards for drinks. Like, there is no harm in that, especially if at the end of the day you're going to be feeling better. So that is all I have for you guys today. That was a pretty general overview of what food sensitivities can look like. Obviously, there is so much more research to be done, and I can link some of those websites just about food sensitivity in general down below, as well as some supplements that I really like and some food sensitivity testing that I would recommend getting if you feel like you too may have a food sensitivity. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions or you want me to do any other sort of health videos along these lines, please leave them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow me on Instagram, which will be right here. All right, thank you so much, guys. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.